Well, good afternoon. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces in the room, and some new faces in the room. My name's Angelique Power. I am the Senior Program Officer for Culture at the Joyce Foundation. I'm so excited for the conversation that we are going to have this afternoon. We have two venerable researchers who will be discussing, unpacking terms like cultural planning, terms like research agenda, and it's all of this conversation that we've been having since Commissioner Michelle Boone took on the role of creating the cultural plan for our city. I like to watch Michelle roll her eyes when I say the word cultural plan. So for those of you who may not know Betty Farrell, you should be ashamed of yourself because she's extremely amazing. She's the executive director of the University of Chicago's Cultural Policy Center. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. And at the Cultural Policy Center, she works on so many things. She works with scholars, she works with art practitioners, she develops interdisciplinary research projects, public programs, cultural policy courses. She's tackled really important issues that face the arts. Recently, she and the Cultural Policy Center published the Set in Stone research piece, which really looked at the building boom that happened in the mid-1990s with a lot of arts organizations. And not only did it unpack the impact that those new buildings had on the organizations themselves, but on the communities that surrounded them. Another landmark study was the Joyce-funded report called Mapping Cultural Participation, as well as Betty. I was able to work with Betty recently on the research agenda for the city of Chicago, which we did also with DCASE's support, and trying to really become futurists in residence and imagine what the city of Chicago would look like in 2030 and 2050, and then figure out what we need to prepare ourselves culturally for that shift. And Betty will talk more about that, I think, this afternoon. Betty's currently leading a major initiative at the Cultural Policy Center to develop a new global network for arts and culture research. So she's doing convenings in Washington, D.C. around cultural heritage, in Paris on creative placemaking, and in Beijing on the development of cultural industries and contemporary art. Joining Betty today is Ann Markison. Thank you for being here. She is a professor emerita of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and she now directs the Arts Economy Initiative. She's also the principal of Markison Economic Research, and she's really been at the forefront of researching kind of all things in the arts, artist careers, housing, location choices, and the critically important contribution that the arts make to economic development, to quality of life. And many people know her from the work that she's done framing policies and practices around creative placemaking. And in fact, I think if you Google creative placemaking, the very first thing that comes up is Ann's study that kind of gave us that language and some of the framing a while ago. So she has such a vast publication record, it would be impossible to cover all of that here, but I'll mention two pieces just to give you a sense of her range. She helped to publish one really highly influential report called The Artistic Dividend, the Art's Hidden Contributions to Regional Development, and more recently a study called Crossover, How Artists Build Careers Across Commercial, Nonprofit, and Community Work. So we're delighted that we were able to lure her away. She's in town for the meeting of the Association of American Geographers. An exciting meeting. So we are really excited that we were able to pair her with our own local research rock star for this conversation. I will leave us in the capable hands of Ra Joy, who is the Executive Director of Arts Alliance Illinois, the state's leading voice for the arts. Ra is also a friend and a co-conspirator in lifting arts and artists in a forceful and equitable way. So we're in your hands.
Thank you, Angelique, for maybe I should just take a few minutes to revel in the idea of being a research rock star, because those are not words that go together very often. It's my pleasure to get to tell you about a really interesting project that started last year in 2014 with the Joyce Foundation and with the support of the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. The Cultural Policy Center at the University of Chicago launched what is really a quite unusual project. We wanted to try to develop a research agenda for the arts for the city of Chicago, but we wanted to do it in a quite untraditional way. The traditional way of doing research is either the ideas spring from the minds of researchers themselves about something they'd like to work on. Sometimes they spring from the minds of funders also, who say this is what we think should be worked on. We decided to do something that was very different, and that was to generate a crowdsourced and really use this as a brainstorming exercise to think, to talk with people across the city. We wanted to engage with the stakeholders for the arts and to really think about how to envision Chicago as a global cultural city in the very long-range future. We asked people to think ahead really to the 22nd century, which was really a big challenge. So the first question really was posed this way. What do we need to know now and prepare ourselves at this moment for in terms of the kind of research we should be doing to ensure that we're the kind of global cultural destination city of the future? When people talk about global cities, what they generally mean are cities that are financial and commercial hubs of a global economy. And so that's been a very important part of thinking about cities generally. But there's also a move and an interest in thinking about what a cultural global city is. And by that, people mean it's the kind of city that is livable, it's accessible, the arts are spread across the city, they are this is a place that's attractive to locals who live there as well as to international and national visitors because of the cultural amenities and resources that they have. I guess that sort of in summary, in a lot of literature, I see four things that people look at when they're talking about global cultural cities. They say a global cultural city needs to provide lots of cultural opportunities. So it needs a cultural infrastructure and it needs informal opportunities for people to participate. It offers both cultural consumption and participation, not always the same thing. It involves a sense of cultural vitality, what gives a city or neighborhoods or parts of cities a sense of buzz that people want to be there and want to participate in. And it's a place where there's cultural diversity. So those four things are kind of characteristics of global cities. But one of the most striking things to me in looking at some of these characteristics and the literature is to say, but a great city of a great cultural city is not just a cookie-cutter city that has all the same characteristics everybody else has around the world. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to go there or visit it. So what is it that it is culturally, locally distinctive about a place? And so that's the challenge of becoming a place that is cosmopolitan and is recognized as such, but is also a place that there is a lot of attention on what is the local distinctiveness of the place. So we asked people with that as our goal to help us think futuristically, and this is a meeting. We had several public meetings, 3 of them with stakeholders throughout the arts. We had about 150 people attend, and some of you may have been among those, with very free-flowing conversations. This is Julia Perkins leading us in one of our discussions, and with as wide a group as we could get to come. And we, as Angelique said, we wanted to think futuristically, but not in a science fiction kind of way. We wanted to be what, I'm lifting a term from Michael Rogers, who calls himself a practical futurist and has been the futurist in residence for the New York Times and other places. So we're thinking very broadly about what a future city looks like that is amenable to visitors and locals for its arts and culture offerings, but it's also practical, and that is we want to think about the practical or pragmatic steps that will help us get there. So in order to ground the conversation, we started with just a very quick set of parameters that we've drawn from demographers and social scientists to tell us, they didn't quite take us into the 22nd century, but they got us to about 2050, midway through this century, and that we use this to help us think. So we wanted to look first around issues of race and ethnicity. And this is a chart that is showing you in the columns races, racial categories that the census uses to define the population. On the far left is 1980, and over on the far right is a projection to 2050. And I think what I really just want to point out quickly in this chart is that green line that is going down here, that is, and it's dotted as we get into projections for the future. But what you see that is roughly around 2030, sometime in that general framework, the U.S. is moving toward much more demographic diversity, and the proportion that line is suggesting, this is the line of non-Latino or non-Hispanic white population, is becoming, dropping under 50%. So for the first time in U.S. history, there's not going to be a majority group in the society, and that we don't know what that means. That is certainly something that will happen in the future. These down here, these circles, you can see the growth of the Latino population for the U.S. as a whole. In 1980, it was just about 6%, and by 2050, 30%. So really dramatic changes taking place there. This is another example of this, which is to say, in terms of immigration, first and second generation immigrants are projected to be a majority, a larger group than before in our history. So that's a very important change as well. It's going to be an all-time high. We looked at aging. And this chart tells you very quickly, you look where those two lines cross, a time that's coming up very soon, where the population, the U.S. population of people who are 65 years and older is increasing, as you can see, and in the relatively near future will surpass the number of those, the green line, who are under the age of 15. We are an aging population. We're not actually aging as quickly as some other countries around the world. Europe and Japan, for example, are moving in this in a much quicker way to this situation, but it's still a very striking phenomenon. In terms of urbanization, this is a hard chart to read, except all you need to look at are the colors. The dark blue color is an urbanized population of over 80%. So the top is 2011, middle is 2030, and at the bottom, most of the world has become an urban population. So as it's darker blue, it's more urbanized, and green and turquoise is slightly less so, but most of the white color or the beige color that you see on the top of the chart has disappeared by then. So the world population will be 70% urban. We in the U.S. are already well over 90% living in urban. This is one that I really like to show because I think it suggests these are the growth of what demographers call mega regions, and you can see the Great Lakes is a great big mega region of 2050. The biggest circle, which covers Chicago there, is looking at 6 million people and above. So these are parts of the world that are going to be changing very much. And I should say, putting together this map of where people are living with the aging population is also really interesting, because it's not, of course, equal everywhere, but the Great Lakes is one of the areas of the world that's expected to have an aging population. Okay, and finally, I just want to show a quick slide that shows us about workforce. The descending line here is the essentially manufacturing jobs that are disappearing. There's a decline in those traditional industrial working class jobs. There's been a rise in, the red line is service sector jobs. And what you see here are what are called creative industries or creative sector jobs. And that is a growing part of the situation now, the population. In the next decade, it's projected that this purple line on the bottom is going to be added to with about 10 million more jobs. That already 40 million Americans work in that sector. When we talk about the creative sector, it usually refers to a very broad group of highly educated, fairly high-skilled workers that include science and technology, art and design, culture and entertainment, the kind of knowledge-based occupations. So one of the things to just think about this is, or to look at, is that these two lines here are kind of moving in a somewhat parallel situation. There's a bifurcation in the population that's going into the future of skills, educational skills, lower versus higher. The creative sector jobs themselves, which require more education, are not necessarily permanent jobs. We're looking at an economy that where creative sector jobs will be geographically based. They will be often project-based, so that once the project's over, people move on to other occupations. So sporadic, temporary, not necessarily lifetime jobs. And we all know the statistics that people are expected to have 11 to 15 jobs in their lifetime in the future. So the question is, this is just background, and we want to get to our study. What did we find? We posed this question to everyone in our discussion groups, and many people sort of came to phrase it as, we wanted to know, what is it that's distinctive about the city of Chicago in terms of its arts world? And people said, what's our deep dish pizza of the arts? How do we understand that ourselves? So we asked, before we started with our conversations, we asked everybody to give us 3 words that they thought described the arts in the city of Chicago. So this is a word cloud, so the larger they are, the more people who responded. And so you will see here, diverse and vibrant and collaborative had the most responses from our participants, but underfunded, segregated, insular also got a fair number of responses as well. So people are thinking about the arts in a very kind of complex way. We had a lot of talk during these conversations. Of course, that's what we were trying to encourage. And we ended up at the Cultural Policy Center trying to summarize some really complex information, and we aren't great artists, but we did it as visually as we could, and that's the one that you have as a handout as well. Basically, what this chart summarizes is that I want to go back to this one. We gave a lot of attention to Chicago being, this is now an ideal of thinking ahead to the future. People said this is a city that incubates, it nurtures, it cultivates, it supports artists and creative workers. That was something that was very important to people. And we called it, if you can read it right down here below, Chicago should be an artist paradise. That was the kind of shorthand that we used. That relates over to this side, that artists are a core of the creative economy and a really important core as well. The creative economy encourages creativity, it encourages innovation, and values the arts as being a really central part of that. So those two are interconnected. And then there was a lot of attention to Chicago being a city of great diversity. So this kind of middle section reads about all of the kinds of organizations and activities that we find inside neighborhoods in the city, but the idea was to think about not just the neighborhoods as they're structured now, but really also ones that are creative enclaves that really they're made up of vibrant neighborhoods. They might be made up of different kinds of cultural clusters where there are organizations across the city, are cultural organizations that are highly inclusive, that there is a lot of moving in and out of them, that space is used very broadly. There are equitable opportunities for cultural participation. And here, I think that is related to that strong sense of civic pride that this core of the city gives to all of us, as well as being a very attractive place for visitors to come. And we ended over here on this side about research, because we were promoting and talking about a city that sees the value of ongoing research. How do you produce and how do you share knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, so that you are constantly thinking about making things better here. So we wanted to say, I mean, we know that this is an ideal image, but it is not just an image for boosterism of Chicago, or thinking about marketing or promoting the city. The idea of research is that we need that kind of credible research and data transparency to be able to make the case and to keep moving forward. So with this as a kind of a visual representation, we moved to develop, we were encouraged by Angelique and others to think about what are the top 10 things that you heard. And I'm going to divide them into sort of 3 categories here, and I would tell you very quickly because it's going to be very wordy, and no need to read all of this because we will give you a link to where we have the report and you can see these questions in more detail. But we thought we need to know what role the arts play in building and sustaining an economically thriving city. So here were just some of the kind of questions, and they're very broad questions, but they're really important ones. And I'm going to single out one here just to look at what will it take essentially to make Chicago an artist paradise, as we started with. And so this is the kind of question that I think many of us probably start by saying that's pretty obvious. Artists need housing and they need jobs. All right, so you don't have to do a whole lot of research in order to understand that. And what I pulled this one out in particular because Ann Markison has done probably more research than anybody else on location choices for artists. And she may talk to us a little bit about that today. But she has given us some examples of where our common understanding doesn't always really fit the reality. So she cites in her research a survey that was done by the city of San Jose, California, that actually surveyed artists and said, what do you need? What do you want to live here? What will make you stay? And they said it wasn't housing, and they weren't referring to jobs because a great number of artists are self-employed to begin with, but it wasn't housing, it was affordable and adequate workspace. So that's something you don't know unless you actually ask the people who are involved, and it's not something that stays the same over time, it's something that changes, so this is very often important to do. We also divided up some of our questions in thinking about the role of arts and culture in the quality of life. Again, lots of different questions that were part of our research agenda, and I want to single this one out, which is a big question for researchers in the arts. It's a critical question that says we need both strong communities and strong neighborhoods, but we also need bridges across those so that the city is pulled together and cohesive and inclusive, and that's a really critical one. So thinking about how the arts can work in that direction. And finally, these were questions that related to thinking about an arts ecosystem, or what will sustain it. And there were a number of questions here, and this one I will just highlight as well, to really say, how are the parts that make up the whole arts world for the city, the commercial arts, the not-for-profit arts, and the participatory arts that people are involved in their everyday life, how do they relate to each other or not? Those are surprisingly questions that we don't know very well. And I'm reminded of a funder who early on in my time in Chicago said to me, we really have no idea that in my organization, I fund the not-for-profit arts, but we really don't know how that fits with the rest of the arts world and in what kind of capacity. I'm doing this in a very short way, and I don't want to take time away from Anne's presentation, but I would like to just end with thinking about the way in which research can help us understand this. One of the people we interviewed in the course of this project said to us, getting housing, safety issues, transportation, and the like right creates the best and most supportive environment for the art, but for art, and a flourishing art sector can help get those things right. And so the idea about really understanding the interdependence and interrelationship, I think, is really critical for understanding how arts make an urban setting a resilient and really strong one. So we're ending here. The report is up at the top. Of that URL is there, and we would invite you, there'll be a link to the report with all the research questions listed on it, but we invite you to add your comments and give us a feedback, because we see very much this process was not one that it begins and ends right now, but it is an ongoing process, and we hope it will contribute to thinking about how the city makes use and our organizations, all of us, make use of the questions and the idea that research can add a really important understanding to the arts in this city. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I've already enjoyed saying hello to some people, and it's so great to be back in Chicago. I'm going to just stand out here because I don't like to stand behind them, and I hope you can see okay. And I really appreciate that Betty just took the 20 minutes we each agreed on, because we really wanted to have a conversation with everybody. And we'll be doing that. We'll be carrying the mic around the room in just a little bit. This meant I had to cut some part of my presentation out, but I think it was really worth doing. So these are the three things I'm going to talk about. These come from a paper that was commissioned by the Journal of Urban Affairs about a year ago, asking me to write a 10-year research agenda for arts, culture, and cities, which was just a lovely, lovely challenge. And it's idiosyncratic, so it's just things I think are really important, and there are a lot of other things that other people have said better than I have, et cetera. But I hope you'll enjoy this, what I hope will be kind of a challenging romp through some of these things. So one is just underscoring this amazing conversation that's happening about the intrinsic versus the instrumental values of the arts. The second is a location theory segment that I did cut way, way down, but we could talk about it, but sort of works to my, expertise as an economist, as a regional and urban economist. But I don't think we know very much about how artists, arts organizations, and arts patrons choose to live between cities, even countries, between neighborhoods and housing units, et cetera, based on what kinds of arts and cultural activity are available around them, or where the patrons are, et cetera. And finally, I'm going to address the really great, exciting challenge of making the arts more diverse and equitable. So that's what I'm going to do. I wanted to also say that, I'm an egghead economist, and I cannot believe how many things I totally missed in my life. And one of them was, I don't know if you know Sarah Lutman, but she's sort of an amazing person who, was vice president of Minnesota Public Radio and the head of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and before that started Intersection for the Arts in San Francisco. Last year she gave me this book by Lewis Hyde, The Gift. I'd never heard of it. How many people have ever read this book? Yeah, about 3 people. This is an amazing book by an intellectual anthropologist. It's about 30 years old. And he basically put together all this research on societies around the world and historically, and pointed out that except for our society, in every other society, when somebody gave you a gift, it was not supposed to be hoarded. It was supposed to be passed on to someone else, as she passed on this used copy of this book to me. And I have passed it on to someone else. So, a pearl that is given to a woman shows up on somebody else's chest a few months later. I love this idea, and he's making a passionate argument in the book for how artists are a really, really key element in this process and that they give gifts to us all. So I love that idea. The intrinsic versus the instrumental value. So I don't think we have to go over this territory again, that we had this huge setback in the 90s, which was really about artists acting out about the AIDS crisis, and John Kalecki has articulated that in a brilliant way. But basically, the Republican Congress tried to zero out the NEA. They didn't completely succeed, but they caused a lot of damage, and funding for artists was almost completely, entirely cut at the national level. And that had reverberations, a lot of corporate, philanthropy pulled back from supporting arts, et cetera. And the major way that we fought our way out of that was by making the case for the economic impact of the art. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So this provocative, wonderful piece, which really took a long time for people to really get it, including me, was written by the RAND Corporation team and published in 2004, trying to reframe the debate about the benefits of the arts, and I really recommend it. And I have to admit that my own first piece, when I stopped working in the military-industrial complex and started working on the arts in the early part of the last decade, my first piece was exactly this kind of argument. Look what artists do for us. They export their work, or they travel to perform, or they bring money for their books, from their books and artworks into our community, and they help cultural industries be more effective. They help non-cultural firms be, more successful, and they make our places attractive to live, et cetera. Strictly instrumental argument. And since I've had so many wonderful opportunities to indulge my own, tastes for the arts and even my limited talents, since then I've just completely really changed my view. So here are just some things to remind you what the arts brings us. Beauty. This is Sherwood Chen, a Taiwanese-American dancer who brought the Buto form of dancing, a post-war provocative form of dancing, from Japan to the United States. Delight, Jeff Raz, a Bay Area circus clown. Humor. I wish I'd bought this print when it was first shown in Minneapolis from our High Point Center for Printmaking. This artist, David Rathman, did a whole series on cowboys, and I love this one. My vices were magnificent. Garrison Keillor, who, as you probably know, goes, is in a different city every other week of the year, practically, with his 30-person team, presenting writing, spoken word, humor, and also music to audiences, and bringing a lot of money back to Minnesota also. But that's not why he's so beloved. Innovation. Here's an example from San Jose's Biennial, which I think there have been 6 of them now, which celebrates the marriage of art and technology. This is an artist rendition, one of a whole art car parade of what they think the environmental car of the future should and will look like. And also innovation in ethnic communities. This woman here is a former opera singer and is a member of the Fond du Lac tribe in Minnesota, and she convinced through long work with her elders that women should be able to play drums in her tribe, and this is her women's drum group, and they are performing in the state capitol in St. Paul. So lots of innovation. Political and social critique. I can't believe how many times I have to say people like, who did those signs in those peace marches that we did in the 60s and 70s, Oh yeah, artists. So this is a group, Hanu Reef, in Los Angeles, and they take their traditional drumming and musical forms from Korea. They're doing an immigrant rights demonstration march in Los Angeles. Keith Knight, a wonderful community activist from Oakland, who also is a nationally well-known cartoonist. This is his iPod assembly line cartoon that he did. Mirrors on ourself and society, and also bridging and bonding across cultures. This is Paul Bonin Rodriguez, who just wrote an amazing book called Performing Policy. He's now a professor at University of Texas, Austin. He's a performance artist, and this piece is sort of encompasses his longer piece about grappling with his Latino, Hispanic, Catholic upbringing and his gayness as a man and all the conflicts in and around that. Elizabeth Partridge, who writes books for teens, and my favorite one is this one about John Lennon, where she's really explaining this iconic man who, by the way, there are Lennon walls in Prague and in Hong Kong now. John Lennon Walls, not Vladimir Lennon Walls, and Creativo, an example of a Filipino lesbian group that got together because they were struggling so much trying to explain to their Filipino families about their gayness. Lion Dance, Wilson Ma, a technician for the San Francisco Opera who volunteers with his brothers to bring lion dance, which is a Chinese dance form only for men, to keep it alive in the Bay Area, and has introduced women into the lion dance in another form of innovation. Remembering Our History, Native American artist and amazing painter in Minnesota, who does these kind of satires on white and Native interactions historically. This one is hanging in our Science Museum, a huge, huge canvas. Marcus Shelby, who is a big band leader, jazz leader, and who wrote this amazing oratorio, the first of several, about the biggest wartime disaster on American soil, if you don't count Pearl Harbor, which was when 300-some men died in an ammunition explosion, loading ammunition onto a boat. They were all African-American sailors in the Navy. The next day, when those who survived went on strike, they were all dishonorably discharged from the Navy. And he wrote this oratorio and brought it all around the Bay Area and performed it in many moving acts. And one of the results of that eventually was that the Navy reinstated the benefits and, the whatever else you call being instated in the Navy for those remaining men who were still living. So just amazing. Hiro Kosaka, who is a Buddhist monk and artistic director at the Japanese American Culture Center, and did this amazing project with elders in his community to go back and draw the neighborhoods that they remembered in Japan, and then used woodblock prints, which is a Japanese art form, to reproduce them and have a wonderful exhibit. So these are the kinds of things that really are what arts deliver. So how can we really articulate that and get beyond these economic arguments? So there's some wonderful work done by Jennifer Novak, who's in this room. Where are you, Jennifer? Right here, and who works with Betty's team at University of Chicago on trying to get at intrinsic benefits. And this was really started by Alan Brown and Jennifer as a response to the Gifts of the Muse piece. And they did an initial study, maybe Jennifer would tell us about it later, where they actually went out and asked people and tried to get from people who participate in arts, and particularly this is about live performance, what their experience was. And these are some of the things that they really are discovered or articulated: captivation, intellectual stimulation, emotional resonance, spiritual value, aesthetic growth, and social bridging. And in a wonderful new study, which I only just found out about this January in San Francisco, called Counting the Beans, a follow-on study that Alan Brown did with Rebecca Ratskin and supported by the whole Bay Area theater community, actually did surveys in a whole bunch of cities across the country. I don't know if Chicago was included. I think Chicago was included. And funders from the different cities helped pay for this. A very deep survey. There were 19,000 responses of 18 theaters and 58 productions at those theaters, where they asked people questions when they came out of the theater, not like, how much money did you spend on a restaurant meal across the street? But, what was your emotional response to this performance? And did you feel captivated and blah, blah, blah? The results are really, really fascinating. They're in here. And also, the most powerful statement I have ever read, long, beautiful essay by Clayton Lord, who, is head of the Bay Area Theater Alliance, is in here, his essay on why this is so important for us to do, this intrinsic benefits of the arts. That's his piece. I also recently did my first foray in sort of trying to get beyond what I do see as sort of a preoccupation with big data and metrics and indicators that I think are detached from real questions that we would have about causality and results, et cetera. This was a result, actually, in our creative placemaking study. We called for metrics to evaluate the results of creative placemaking. It was kind of a throwaway line, and pretty soon both the NEA and Art Place had these indicator projects. And I would be speaking around the country in creative placemaking, and I'd be on panels, and there would be the heads of these organizations that had gotten these grants, and they would be saying to me, what is this? They're saying they're going to send us a book with these numbers in it that compare us to other places, and this is supposed to evaluate our creative placemaking thing, which we only started 6 months ago. And they have things in it like home ownership rates going up. Is that a good thing? Cell phone use on a Saturday night, blah, blah, blah. So I got really, I went and looked at these things. I thought, these are really problematic from a social science point of view. So I wrote this rant, actually. I call it my rant. Why creative placemaking industries won't track creative placemaking success. And because I wanted to affect policy and get it out fast, I first published it as a blog in Ian David Moss's wonderful Create Equity site. And he created this, found this amazing graphic for me. I made the sign, but had nothing to say. And underneath it, to cite an artist, from Ansel Adams, there is nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. So I was just thrilled. I just thought, oh, this is really so great. I'm not going to really unpack it. I would like to say that immediately grant makers in the arts asked me if they could republish it. And it's also now published in an international journal. I never had an easier journal article published in my life. So, and basically what I go through in this piece is, just how problematic the indicators are, the data sets they come from, deciding what geographical area you want to have an impact, how these projects take a long time. There's no way that short-term data is going to tell you anything. And, as any social scientist knows, there are a lot of other things going on in the same place and neighborhood that could be producing either positive or negative results. And so how should we evaluate? We should evaluate on the basis of what people said they wanted to do and why you funded them to do those things. And a lot of that is about the intrinsic value of the arts. So it's been very successful. I'm very happy to say Ann Gadwa and I just published a piece in the San Francisco Reserve Bank's Community Investment Review, which is an update of our creative placemaking, How to Do It Well, it's called. And in it I report that both these organizations, ArtPlace and the NAA, are no longer using these indicators to evaluate projects. So I felt like it was a really successful public policy intervention. So I wanted to say one other thing about this. In my state, I just find it so amazing. Americans for the Arts, this is their big thing, economic impact. And in my state, our dynamo of a woman who runs our arts advocacy things thinks this is the only way to talk to legislators. And I just was in Louisiana, and we had the big annual arts, event. We had a really wonderful conference, and then they were all going to go talk to their legislators. And one woman just said to me, when I go into these legislators' office, they just want to say, show me the numbers. And so what I say back is like, this is the weakest argument in the world. If you spend money on anything, you're going to create jobs. So it isn't a very, and I want you to think about how engineers don't have to go to the legislature and say, every job you spend on an engineering project creates more jobs. No, they go say, we're going to build infrastructure for you. Infrastructure is good. And the same thing with people in the healthcare industry. They don't go in and say, every dollar you spend on a doctor is going to be respent again, da-da-da, and so on and so forth. So, and science is the same way. So I don't think it's a very strong argument. I think we really need to get beyond it. And I would like to point out that in 2008, the people of Minnesota voted for a 1% or 0.5% sales tax increase for a carefully polled constitutional amendment that would, for 25 years, set aside this amount of sales tax for clean water, wildlife, and legacy. And it was an amazing, amazing effort by the hunting people, the environmental people, and the arts people to raise money for their areas where they always got beat out every year at the legislature by infrastructure, housing, social services, and so on. And I want you to know that in all of the publicity for that, in that electoral year, nobody ever made the economic impact of any of these things the point. And people in Minnesota voted 56% for this, which has generated for arts alone $50 million more dollars in the state of Minnesota, and you can really see the results of that. So I encourage that. And as Sheila Smith, who is our dynamo, says, actually the best way to get a legislator to vote for arts and culture is to invite them to go to an arts event with you. You have to choose carefully which one you take them to. You have to know something about them. But actually, and you don't give them a ticket. You invite them to go with you, and then you talk about it afterwards. And I just think that's a brilliant thing. Okay, this is the part I think which is my economistic-y part, I've always been interested in location theory. I've taught it a lot. I taught a lot about why industries locate where they do. I came here and worked for Harold Washington for 2 years as the research director of his task force on steel in Southeast Chicago, and I wrote a lot about the location of the steel industry in the U.S. as part of that. And I'm very interested in this as an intellectual question because I think it's important to policy. I see people publishing all the time these studies. Artists really like to live in our city because of the quality of life and everything else, and I think, did you interview the people who left? No, they never did. So artists move a lot because they have high levels of self-employment and they have very high interregional mobility rates, as high as scientists and engineers who have very low rates of self-employment, but they tend to follow jobs. But artists tend to make choices on a different basis. And I've mapped all that. I know what the numbers show, but I don't really know why. So I think there's some interesting things to do about that. In addition, I think we really need to learn a lot more about why arts organizations choose the locations they do. In my Artist Center study in Minnesota, I would ask people this question, and half of them would say, I chose this location because our constituency, which is writers in this case, are all over the Twin Cities, and it's right near the intersection of two freeways. This turned out to be a big mistake for them because they got a branch of our biggest, most wonderful independent bookstore to move in their building, but because there were no artists living around them, there were no people to buy books. People would just come drive their car, get in the parking lot, go to all the wonderful things happening in the building, and then leave. And so the bookstore failed, and then the whole bookstore failed. So that was really a sad thing. So I think that's really an interesting question. And I think it's important because we're so, easy to designate cultural districts, and that's a whole other really interesting thing that we could talk about. But we don't really think hard about what are we doing when we do that. Are we, I remember actually when, Chicago, probably the cultural affairs people, I don't remember who, but this is like 20 years ago, decided that they would create a theater district downtown. And at the time, all the theaters up, in Lincoln Park and area said, what? Are you going to tell us we have to move downtown? And so they sort of, scaled it down to a downtown theater district. But I think those questions are really important. In Berkeley, that happened when the Berkeley Rep built a new building and they pulled Freight and Salvage, this wonderful folk club, out of its neighbor downtown. Nobody asked the question, well, what happened to that neighborhood? So just these questions, I think, are really important for arts and cultural policy in cities. And finally, we do think really, I know that a lot of retired people move downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul, which is so wonderful, because they want to be closer to the arts. But we don't really have any evidence on that. We don't really know how important is that compared to the fact that they can walk through the skyways and walk 5 miles a day all winter long and don't have to mow their lawns out in suburbia. But it would be interesting to know, because the demographics of our cities and what's happening in different neighborhoods is changing, and it's changing a lot with the kinds of things that Betty is talking about in terms of demographic change. So anyway, I hope people will take up these challenges. The final thing I really wanted to talk about is equity and diversity, because you probably know this is bubbling up everywhere. Chicago is such a diverse place, and you've had some of the really wonderful early work here, actually, documenting the whole work that Aleka Wally did, really documenting Latino and other ethnic arts in the city is very important. Susan Feinstein, who is my marvelous colleague from my Rutgers year, has written this great book, The Just City, which has gotten a tremendous amount of attention. And she really unpacks the competition, really, in a way, between goals of equity, diversity, and democracy, and we might also say vibrancy or quality of life or whatever they are, the other things that are there. But these three, I think she does a very, very good job and really shows that each of them is quite different, and it turns out that there's conflict between them. I don't know how many of you know Roberto Bedoya, but he is the director of the Tucson Area Pima Arts Council, and he has been writing some very powerful statements, and this is out of his amazing thing about placemaking and the politics of belonging and disbelonging. He's really raising the issue and really pointing to the fact that some creative placemaking activities have really displaced people who were already there and who were already really creative, and I really recommend his Rauchification piece, which if you just put that long R-A-U-S-C-H-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, you will see it. This is just a one-liner out of it. If creative placemaking activities support the politics of disbelonging through acts of gentrification, racism, real estate speculation, all in the names of neighborhood revitalization, then it betrays the democratic ideal of having an equitable and just civil society. I have seen cases of this in the United States. And there are lots of other cases that, there's cases where neighborhoods have, received new arts and cultural activities or even new retail, and it's been a great thing for them. So it's complicated. If you want to really see something that's going to be fun, Roberto and I are debating each other at the Americans for the Arts meetings, which will be here on the 16th of June, right after the plenary. We are doing a session where we are debating the following proposition. How do they put it in debate? Anyway, the question is, placemaking always causes gentrification or something like that. And at first, they asked me to be the affirmative thing, that it's inevitable. And I said, I don't believe that, so I can't really do it. But anyway, we decided it would be more provocative if we both took these really opposing views. And I think there is there are very, very strong forces that do want to move economic activity around and make money off it. And it's really supported in our private property rights system, et cetera. So how can arts and culture do all the wonderful things we want it to do without really causing displacement, and by also improving the equity of what we do? So I'm going to just move over here a little bit just to be on the other side of the room, really. I did write a paper with Noah Isserman, which particularly looked at the arts and really suggested certain reasons why we have equity problems in the arts and cultural sector, which I think are very big problems. And one of them is just the elite funding and governance structures that have supported, what we have in our kind of received arts organizational structure and venues, arts venues. This is the Disney Center in Los Angeles, the LA Philharmonic Center. And the second is really the Euro-American centrism that we still have in so many of our more established art forms. If you look at what's still taught in American universities in arts and music, et cetera, departments, it's very narrow. It took decades for jazz to finally be recognized and taught in American schools of music. And there are many, many more. I have a wonderful friend who's a mandolin player, and he went to college at the University of Minnesota. They said, I'm sorry, we don't do mandolin here. We only do violin, so on and so forth. Anyway, we have a long way to go. I've done a wonderful study of Native American artists, in which just the artwork is amazing. The techniques are amazing. The results are amazing. The community part of it is amazing. And then third thing is this distinctions we have, which we all still stumble over and debate, between art and craft, between formal and informal, between professional and amateur, and we still get very hung up on those things. And that is, a big challenge for us. So I also would like to say that in my own work, I did this fascinating study using the Cultural Data Project data for California for the Irvine Foundation, and I really found that the data on small arts organizations, which were disproportionately multidisciplinary and ethnic and immigrant organizations, was very, very poor. It was so poor that it looked like this. So I took the tax data from the U.S. government, where I could look at exactly the same, types of organizations for California. And this is how many of all organizations in California were in the CDP sample. It's not a sample. It's just, asking people to take the survey, and the actual distribution in the IRS data. And it's just really was remarkable. And also, if you look at it this way, so ethnic, folk arts, and multidisciplinary organizations, the coverage levels were really small. So this little white line thing is the percent of our estimate of the actual number of organizations captured in the CDP. Where was it high? In performing arts, in arts and cultural support organizations, in music, in visual arts, and really low in these areas which tended to be low-income and ethnic organizations. And I'm hoping it's improving. But one wonderful thing I learned from working with the CDP data asks organizations how many volunteers you have and how many paid staff people you have. And I was able to use this data, and again, I took the IRS data and kind of adjusted for the under and over counting, and I found this amazing thing. So really, at the biggest arts organizations with budgets of $2 million a year, they only have one volunteer for every 5 paid staff people. Think like a big museum. But when you get down to this range, 25,200, 7 volunteers to every paid staff person. And this, for the really smallest organizations, 31 volunteers to every paid staff person. You think, how could that be? Okay, we did 30 case studies in California, or 40 maybe. So Barrio Writers, a group of teachers in Santa Ana, California, who spend their summers working for total free to help kids do spoken word and poetry, finding venues, taking them around, taking them to contests, building their esteem, and making them into artists. And their budget is $5,000 a year. So with each of these groups, we asked them, if you paid people, you know, what they would be worth to do this work, how big would your budget be? And they go, oh, $250,000. Yeah, so what's the point of that? That we tend to think about the significance of arts organizations on the basis of their size of their budgets or their revenue, not on the basis of actually how much human energy and intelligence and expertise is going into it. So that just was another wonderful little thing. I really recommend our Native Artist Study, where Marcy Rendon, who's a Native American writer and playwright, and I spent a year and a half staying at casinos because it was the cheapest place to stay, going all over Minnesota. We profiled these 50 artists, and we did a tremendous amount of work trying to understand their experience in terms of their families, their education, their training, their art forms, their service, their community sensitivity around sacred issues of sacred practices and materials, and how they were treated by their own organizations, including casinos, and which was often not that great, and by all the other arts institutions in the state. And it's a very, very grounded study, and I think is a huge, huge window into how difficult it is to be an artist in immigrant and ethnic organizations. Just the other day, I received this amazing thing in the mail, which is a study done of Chicago of ethnic and immigrant arts by 3 students at the Art Institute of Chicago. Are any of them here? This is just an amazing study. It's like our Native Artist Study. It's very grounded, and it's all about, and I just could only put the cover up here, but I really recommend it. I think you can find it fairly easily. Kate Dumbleton's here. Where are you? Or I think she had to go back to a faculty meeting. She's teaching at the Art Institute, and she said the whole faculty thought these 3 students were crazy. I mean, this piece is the quality of, you know, something that I would have worked on for like 5 years. So I really recommend it, and I've just barely started reading it myself. So I'm trying to keep to my 20 minutes here, so if you want more, this is where my piece is published, the Journal of Urban Affairs, which is probably not that accessible to some of you. Just write to me. I think on my website I have the pre-publication version because, you know, we're not permitted, even though we don't get paid for this work, you know, the press does spend money on editors, thank goodness, and, you know, all the efforts to publish these journals, and so that's why you can't necessarily get it free off the web, but you can get the pre-publication policy off my annmarkison.com website. And I just want to leave you with this question. So we've talked about research and what research can do. It is really hard to be an arts researcher in this country. It is really hard to find people who will fund your work, and that includes the NEA, which is has a good research shop, and they do some good in-house things, but has very, very little money for research. And so that's one question, who will fund it, but also who will do it? One of the things I love about working in this arts research world is how many people from different disciplines are working in it. Some people that are coming out of, you know, cultural disciplines, a lot of people from sociology, from anthropology, from creative writing, and so on. And so that's been wonderful for me because I really believe in interdisciplinary research. Okay, so that's that. And annmarkison.com, you can probably get all my publications off there just by going there. And we'd really like to have a conversation. So, do you want to introduce the conversation?
How about this? How about a round of applause for Ann Markison and Betty Farrell? My name is Rod Joy, and I serve as Executive Director for Arts Alliance Illinois. I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to make an effective case for the value and importance of culture and the arts. So I'm thrilled to join Betty and Ann for a dialogue. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we want to talk about what this all means for the future of Chicago. We want to talk about what this data means for the individuals and organizations that you serve and represent. Your voice, your questions, and your comments are a big part of this next segment. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask if you have a question to please raise your hand and I'll get to you. But to get things started, and you left off talking about the NEA and the NEA's research shop. And Sunil Iyengar, the research and analysis director from the NEA, was just here in Chicago for the Lake Effect Summit. And we had a discussion about the evolution of the arts sector. And some close observers believe that the arts started out focusing on quality. And then the next generation, there was a focus on access and participation. And that the future is all about impact and social impact. And so my first question is, do you agree with that assessment? And if you do, what are some indicators that you're aware of that really measure social impact?
Whoa. She gets to go first. That's a huge question. I think that all of the above are parts of what we're looking at. So they're not really separate fields of inquiry. We're concerned about quality, access, and impact. I think we're starting, and much of the work that Anne was describing, and I think it's really, it's something I applaud coming particularly from an economist, because she's really thinking beyond just economic metrics that we are have been using in particular. So one of the things I would say is I think we have lots of new opportunities to think about the ways that the arts intersect with other aspects of life. So thinking about arts as an impact and its impact on health. Just sort of general quality of life issues are really important. And thinking about, and the NEA as well as Arts Place America and lots of the other organizations that are really thinking broadly about this are really now moving in the direction of thinking, how do the arts impact community development, or how could they, in a way that we haven't thought of before? So if you're focused on thinking about housing and transportation and public safety, what role could arts play in that? So in a sense, kind of removing ourselves as an arts sector, arts and culture sector, from being so separate, just about arts and culture, but thinking about the ways in which they're interconnected with other parts of livable cities and thriving cities, I think is the direction we are going.
Well, I would just say two things about it. I hope we don't get into a whole thing about trying to develop social impact indicators. But I would say that the creative placemaking thing, to me, has been brilliant, because it's about asking arts organizations to walk out their doors and to be actively engaged in their neighborhood, in their community, et cetera. And I give that total credit to that to Rocco Landesman and Joan Shigekawa and their amazing teamwork between the commercial and nonprofit sector, two seasoned people. And I think arts organizations are beginning to see that can be great for them, because artists and arts organizations, we have skills that nobody else has, and we can bring them out. And one of the amazing things that Rocco Landesman did when he first came to Washington, as I said 3 years ago, he looked around and he looked at his budget and he wept. And then he looked around, he saw all these rich agencies in Washington. He said, wow, I'm going to go call on I'm going to ask the Secretary of Health and Human Welfare and Housing and Urban Development Transportation out to lunch one by one, and I'm going to pitch to them what arts and culture can do for their mission. So this is like, a producer in action, right? So he's figuring out how arts and culture can piggyback on, and he made real friends, not with all of them. He made real connections, and those connections have resulted in activity for artists. For instance, they have a big project with the Department of Defense at Walter Reed Hospital, where they use writing and music to help vets who've come back from the Middle East cope, with their disabilities and their missing limbs and everything else. So that's an amazing example. So to me, I'm not so interested in trying to figure out how we measure it. I just want to see us doing it more and documenting it. In our creative placemaking study, we have an amazing case from the Fond du Lac Reservation, where the director of the new 5-building social service complex, debated with his tribal leadership. He said, for every building we build, I want 2% of the cost of the building to go to purchases of contemporary Native American art from Native American artists, so that we can support the artists, and because art is a part of healing, and I want to hang that art, and it can be traditional beadwork, it can be really contemporary, wild stuff. I want it hanging in every room, and corridors, murals on every corridor of these 5 buildings. And he's done that, he's created, it's an amazing thing. So how do we measure the impact of that on health? That's very hard to say. I just know that I can see he feels like it's one of the most important things they've done for health.
Part of something that came to mind when Ann was talking about beauty was imagining making a case to Governor Ronner about the value and importance of the arts and hinging it all on this notion of beauty. But you mentioned Rocco Landisman, and I think his claim to fame was this notion of an across-the-board approach to culture and the arts, embedding the arts into the everyday business of federal agencies and departments. And I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes the Chicago Cultural Plan. And for the arts to thrive in this city, we not only need a strong Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, but the arts need to play a strong role in our schools and in our parks. I'm going to open this up for questions, but I'm going to throw out one more, and it's this notion of both and versus either or. And I believe that it's important to think about both the intrinsic and instrumental value of the arts and not an either or. And I'm curious, when we think about this notion of global and global city and power of place and neighborhoods, and some people have this view that you can't have both, that if you invest in neighborhoods, it's going to come at the expense of pushing Chicago forward as a global city. I'm curious if you have thoughts about neighborhood cultural development and how that aligns with this notion of global and international. And then I see you in the back. You'll get us started with your questions.
That's one of the things that came out of our discussions, and I think when people tried to think what is the deep dish pizza for the arts in Chicago, they immediately came to neighborhoods. We're a city of neighborhoods. We're a city of ethnic neighborhoods traditionally, but the notion that it sort of expanded in the course of our conversation was people come to the city not just to be downtown, but also to be able to experience the richness of the cultural, and I mean in this case ethnic cultural diversity, but it could also be about different parts of the city being different kind of cultural zones where different activities are going on. So I see it not as a contradiction of the global cultural city, but really what people would come to Chicago for, to the kind of rich history and possibilities that are here. To do that, you need to be able to get around, all right? You need to be able to so the transportation network needs to be accessible, all sorts of sense of perception about the city and which neighborhoods you feel safe to go into. All of that is part of a perceptual issue about the selling of the city to the outside world as well. But I think it is not, to me, it is what would make a global city in this space, is to build on the strong tradition Chicago has of being so neighborhood-based with really distinct neighborhoods.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I've had this book, Distinctive Cities, on the shelf for a long time. We did publish an article on it, and I really believe that's an important part. I think, there's a really big agenda here with your tourism agencies in every city and every state. Pretty much the tourism agency is the captive of the biggest organizations, like, the big hotels, McCormick Place, the biggest arts institutions. It is so, I'm a theater maven. I find it so difficult to go to any city in the United States, which I travel a lot, and I want to go to the theater. I can't find out what's going on. There's no easy way to find out what the reviews are, what's happening, which place. One day, though, I got up in San Diego in a W hotel, and on the back of my door was this little thing that listed the theaters and the jazz clubs that were in the neighborhood and what I could do that night. And I was like blown away, and I went. So, and my biggest, kind of dream idea is that every airport would have, where you have captive audience, and half the people are from your region and half the people are from somewhere else. And while they're in there, they can see snippets of all the different productions going on in the city, the neighborhoods. You can print yourself out a map. You can buy a ticket there. You can get all the information you want so that, you can feel like you can do exactly what you're saying. And also I want to say that I'm really not big on sort of this global schmobal stuff. Your biggest audience, your biggest potential audience are people who are living in your region. If you get them excited about what you're doing, other people will want to come here. So, because the word spreads. So that, I think, is a really, really important thing. How can we reach all of those, working class people, for instance? I always like to point out how the most successful exhibit at the Guggenheim in New York was an exhibit on motorcycles. And people lined up for 2 blocks along Fifth Avenue in motorcycle jackets to get into that exhibit. Of course, the critics panned it, right? Oh, motorcycles. And then in Minnesota, the Guthrie Theater did a production of Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed, which was about her working, in a fast food place, cleaning motel rooms, and what was the other one? I've forgotten. Anyway, and it was a fabulous thing, and it kept being held over and over and over because so many people came. I was overjoyed because I'd missed it. I went, and everybody around me was wearing union jackets. Finally, a play about working people. Finally. I mean, there are a few others, but so I think that we just need to think about all those kinds of things, and we need to really work with our arts establishment about opening up a lot more and really, and doing, helping us create this understanding of what a rich culture we're in. Yeah, and by the way, not just questions. Let's have people comments, pushback, disagreement.
All right, great. I see 3 hands, and we're going to start in the back, in the black.
And could you please stand up and say your name so we know who you are, where you're from?
Hi, I'm Meredith Aska-McBride from the University of Chicago. Thank you for wonderful talks. So today we've heard a lot about the arts and culture as kind of a block. And I'm wondering, both in terms of the research and the policy agenda, how we can drill down and be more discipline specific. Because of course, music, dance, theater, visual arts, whatever, have different needs, different contexts, often very different. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that and the role you see of different disciplines and how we can specify. And in terms of the justifications that we give, things need to be different based on different types of arts disciplines.
Do you want to say something?
Just quickly, we have one of the studies about Chicago that we did at the university, at the Cultural Policy Center last year, was on the creative economy of Chicago compared to about 8 other cities around the U.S. And metro regions, so that we could get into some comparability across cities. And we did look very specifically at different artistic disciplines, and it included, Jennifer, as an author of it, will help me here, but it included where people lived, it included wages and salaries that people earned. There's a surprising number of dancers in this city who don't earn income at all from their art form. There are others who are in very different kind of categories. So I think it's really important to look specifically at disciplines and kind of dividing up that understanding, because artistic careers and lives and some of those location choices that Anne was talking about are going to be very different by disciplines. But it's also, we do want, I think about it as looking at the broad perspective and really getting the landscape much more generally, to look at the arts as a whole sector, and then looking very specifically in kind of close-up detail at what arts are like. It's all important.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that different artistic disciplines from an organizational point of view are really different. So these studies that I've mentioned by Alan and Jennifer and Rebecca are on the live theater. And live theater, is a wonderful thing. It's a really challenging art form. It's so collective. You have all these different actors involved in the process. And I don't mean just actors. And, and it could have a lot bigger audience than it has. So it's a challenge, but it's hanging in there. Symphony orchestras are in deep trouble. There are a lot of great studies out there about why they're in trouble. And one of them is the venues that they perform in and the aging of the population and their inability to really adjust to changing demographics. Opera, amazingly, has really had a very different experience, and I think partly because they've commissioned so many interesting new works, but also because, certain groups of people have really, gravitated to them, and they have, very, very wealthy patrons. So Alan Brown has written another amazing piece that's in Grantmakers for the Art Reader, and I can't remember the name of the piece at the moment. I'm so embarrassed, but it's cited in a piece that he and I wrote together for a conference actually in Portugal called From Audience to Participant. And he's arguing from his work and the participation work, which Jennifer worked on too. So they've done a lot of work in California on participation. Jennifer has a new study coming out on that from the Irvine population, where they're trying to understand how a lot of other people participate in the arts, which is like the National Endowment for the Arts added attendance at salsa concerts to their survey of public participation in the arts in 2008, and the percentage of participation went up by 3 percentage points, from like 49 to 52% in California. That's attendance at salsa conference. Now they're really expanding the survey to ask, do you dance? Do you dance at home? You know, just to really kind of get at the fact that many people are participating in arts forms in other ways. The other argument that Ellen makes that I think is powerful is that people really care about the venue. They don't necessarily want to walk into a concert hall where the musicians don't pay any attention to them, and they want to feel good. They care who else is in the thing. They like Merce Cunningham came to Minnesota and did his last public performance in a gravel pit in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and it was evidently amazing. I wasn't there, so this whole idea of walking out the doors and doing your performance in different spaces and addressing different audiences. I think that's a lot of where we need to go. And each discipline, which I'm so glad you raised it, has to figure out what their particular challenges are and to address that.
Yeah, according to NEA data, the number one reason why people participate in cultural events is the social aspect, interacting with others. The second reason why people participate is this notion of place and the power of place. We have limited time, and I saw at least 2 more hands, so let's go to Susan, and then we'll come here.
I'm Susan Fox. I work with Operatic, and you may have read something about Operatic in the last day or two, vis-a-vis the 606 Bloomingdale Trail. So I think this might be a perfect example of doing some study about creative placemaking, because here we have a new, this linear park that's being built in Logan Square and Humboldt Park. And, okay, so it's in the neighborhoods, and it's not really accessible via public transportation very easily, because I go to the meetings of Operatic, and I take a bus, and I take a train, and then I walk. So it's not, is it a tourist attraction, or is it something for the neighborhood? And I'd really like to see some kind of thought put into studying how this unfolds, which it will on June 6th. It's now announced that June 6th is the opening. So any remarks?
Could we hear from all the people in the room who would like to say something, and we won't say anything? Just so we can hear all the different things people have on their minds.
And please keep in mind there are a number of hands, so try to be as succinct as possible with your comment or your question.
I'm Martha Frisch, Janes Walk, Chicago. Pratt Institute in New York has recently instituted the first master's program in creative placemaking, and it comes out of an urban planning historic preservation point of view. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what they could, or other programs that come along, could include in their curriculum besides urban planning and historic preservation.
Let's just hear from more
Jennifer.
people, and then if there's time, we can say something.
Sure. Jennifer Novak-Leonard. I'm with the Cultural Policy Center at the University of Chicago. I'm an arts research person. I'm a fan of the arts, but also the part of research is about transparency and understanding limitations of information, being able to have fair and transparent information. And there's a lot of excitement, but I also felt some tension in the room of trying to have those more open conversations about limitations of what the arts can achieve, what it can achieve, how that discussion. So I'm excited about, as the conversations evolve, as we talked about quality, accessibility, etc., and now about social impact, but also about more open conversations of how research can inform the work of arts, but also getting past that fight of purely using the cherry-picking information to forward the arts. So I look forward to open conversations.
Other comments or questions? We'll do a lightning round. In the back, Allison.
Barbara.
I'm Allison Zare, and I'm wondering about the tension, too, as the research moves forward, between and you brought it up, when amateurs, more and more amateurs are becoming involved in the arts, and we're valuing that as well. And the tension around what is quality, and the tension around professional versus amateur, the tension around, I had something else in my head, but there are a number of sort of dichotomies when you're talking about the arts that don't happen when you're talking about medicine or engineering. You can't have amateur engineers. And a lot of this Paradise for Artists, it is about people who are not professional artists participating in the arts. And that's what's really going to help animate And I can imagine that there's going to be a lot of tension moving forward as people, oh, I know what was Eurocentric arts as well, where people want to hold on to the type of art and hold on to the concept of professional artists versus amateur. So.
I would like to say just one really quick thing. There's this fabulous piece written by Larry Gross called Art and Artists on the Margins. That's the title of the book, too. And he's the USC Dean of Communications. And he makes this point that in all primitive societies, everybody learns how to sing and dance and play a musical instrument. And it does not mean that they don't know who's really good at it. On the contrary, they really know, and they give that person a place of honor in their society.
We're about out of time. I saw 2 more hands, and why don't we go ahead and get those final 2 questions and comments, and why don't we then give a minute or 2 to both Anne and Betty for their closing thoughts. Janet? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll try and be really quick. I'm Sarah Grady. I've just moved to Chicago from Europe, so this idea of European-centric and what Europe's trying to do is really high on my agenda right now, and I've done a lot of work with arts and science and that kind of collaboration, looking at art and technology and design and STEAM versus STEM and all of that stuff. And one of the interesting things about this tension that certainly feels in this room and a lot of the research agenda is coming up in science too, because there's a lack of understanding and celebration of failure. When all of our stories are about what we're doing well and cherry picking these, this went perfect, look at this awesome tiny thing where 12 people had a great time and we all cried with joy, is awesome. A lot of us are in the arts for that, but when we can't talk about what's not working, why isn't this right, how can we come together and be brave about what's wrong, I think we're all lacking something in how we can move forward together.
Have you heard of the Great Chicago Fire Festival?
Yes, briefly, and I think an interesting case study.
We had 1 more hand.
No, also Barb.
Hi, I'm Wendy. I'm Wendy Hill. I work with the Business Volunteers in the Arts. I'm just wondering if you all could comment. We're thinking about how the arts impacts the economy in the future. I'm wondering if there's any research or dialogue about how the economy is impacting the arts in terms of, for instance, we all know that there's this shrinking middle class, and Chicago is an amazing city when it comes to the middle class. So what kind of research or implications are there in terms of not only sustaining the institutions, but sustaining the communities that support these institutions in the middle and on both ends?
Great. Barbara?
Thanks, both of you. I'm Barbara Kennan. I work here at the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. You know, the only thing that struck me I thought everything that you talked about was really fascinating and compelling, and I have a lot more reading to do with all the reports. But one of the things that struck me that I haven't heard captured yet that I want to put out there is that for many artists, I don't know that affordable housing or transportation or any of those things are really what compels, or even neighborhoods, are what compels them to become artists and to move somewhere. I think what makes them want to come somewhere is the opportunity to explore and to collaborate and to do things as unfettered as possible. And so I don't know how you describe that in the research, but I think that would be a really important thing to try to describe. And part of it is the anecdotalness that you talked about in the stories and bringing the politicians to experience something personally and talking to them. I think that's really important. But in a lot of this research, a lot of the metrics seem to be about these conventional definitions that really aren't getting at the nugget of what it is that is causing creative people to want to create and to locate somewhere. And I also think schools are also super important hubs in almost all of these places, and unpacking the impact that they have and the potential that they have to even more impact the cities that they're in is something that also would be really important.
So a lot of terrific comments and questions. Before we wrap up, I'm going to turn it to both Betty and Anne to see if they have any reflections or comments, closing comments that you'd like to make.
She's turning to me first, always. I think the kind of comments that you've all raised are really interesting ones for us to think about. I'm thinking about the ways that the arts make a difference in terms of creating opportunities for participation and a range of participation. So it's not just about attending professional arts events, but of course we want those as well. But we want lots of possibilities of creative expression. It's about empowerment, along with some of the terms about justice and equity in cities that I think are really critical. There are lots and lots of challenges, and I just really think that we want to second a couple of the points that people made about the power of what research can do, because sometimes we think that is just really what academics do in their ivory towers of their universities, and the real thing is happening in the work that people are actually doing and engaging in the arts. And I really think our world should be closer together than that we really need to understand how and why things work, and we need to be very transparent about that. And the kind of learning from failure, learning from what doesn't work. There's no city in the world that I know of that makes that transparent. To me, a great deep dish pizza for the arts is a Chicago that embraced that and said, we want to try different things. We're going to announce, we're going to be clear about it when they don't work, but we're going to learn from that as well. And I really think it's an incredible opportunity for a city that has such a rich history with participatory engagement in the arts. The way people turn out in the city for the cultural plan and for discussions about those, the way they turned out. Can you imagine us asking people to spend their valuable time to talk about what things should look like in the 22nd century? And they did that with great generosity. So I think that is something that could distinguish a city that's willing to sort of embrace a kind of an urban laboratory for arts and culture, and how that works to enhance the city. It would be a wonderful tribute to Chicago.
Thanks. Well, I feel like there's a lot of conversations that can really go on, and I'm glad to join in whatever way I can. I just make two comments. One to the woman who talked about Europe. I've had this wonderful experience in the last few years of being invited to come and give keynotes for creative placemaking conferences in other countries. Most recently in Prague, which is going to be, Prague and Pilsen are the European capital of culture this coming year. And it was an amazing, it wasn't just a keynote, it was working with people for 2 days in anticipation of everything they would do in all kinds of different groups. And one of them, there were 20 people in my group, I just listened the whole time. So I think this whole idea of creative placemaking is beginning to really, I mean, that's just a rubric. People have been doing it for a long time in a lot of places. And also, I've just been speaking on it. I'm going to Korea in September. I spent the fall in Japan the year before last. I just spent 6 weeks teaching in Toronto. Brazil, I spent a lot of time. So I think it's a way that across the world, we can all participate in this and do it in a way that's really embedded and very distinctive to our cultures. And I think it'll do great for us all around the world. And I love Barbara's challenge, and I don't really think I have full answers to it, but I do want to say one thing about the schools. So the same Larry Gross in the same article really talks about his studies of art teachers in K through 12 and how their major mission is to tell most of us that we don't have talent and that a few people that we really do. And he said that this is why most parents don't care if their kids have music and art in school, because they didn't really, they weren't good at it themselves, and it's not a career path and anything else. And I think that adults are really important. So I think the reason we can't get anywhere with art and music in the schools in most places in this country is because the parents don't care. So we have to really think about adult engagement, and I really think that's where it's at. People want to dance. They want to pick up their high school instrument. They want to sing with other people. They want to learn art. This is a great thing for all these retiring baby boomers, among other things. But I really think that we shouldn't just be aiming at the schools. We should be aiming at, as you put it, like everybody in the population and helping everybody find, that creative expression and doing it with others, which is such a wonderful thing. Thank you.
All right. We believe that data and research are powerful tools for shaping arts policy, practice, and engagement. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Ann Marcuson and Betty Farrell. We'd like to thank the Cultural Policy Center for organizing today's discussion and for the Joyce Foundation for their generous support of this initiative. We're barely scratching the surface on such a robust conversation. I don't think our panelists are dashing for the doors quite yet, So if you'd like to talk more or get their business card, please see them now. For those of you who inquired about data, if you visit accelerateculture.com, there's a series of 6 issue briefs that's really designed to get after where Chicago is excelling and where it can improve from a cultural lens. And we invite you to visit that site for more information. Thank you all. Have a good day.